There are two things that Formula One fans have learned about McLaren's team principal Andreas Seidl over the past few months. Firstly, the ex-Porsche WEC boss runs a very tight ship, taking the helm of an upwardly mobile McLaren and so far keeping it at the front of a hotly contested midfield pack. But secondly, and one that's become apparent in recent weeks, is that he seems to love having a dig at the other teams. And by other teams, we mean Racing Point. Consistently calling the RP20 last year's Mercedes, he stuck the boot in further after Renault's protest over the allegedly copied brake ducts. Seidl stated, "This protest is another key element on making some clarifications on the FIA and Formula One side of what they want Formula One to be in the future. Do they want that Formula One is ending up in a copying championship? In a championship where you end up with 2 or 3 constructors or manufacturers and we simply have more cars of one manufacturer or constructor on track?" His premonition of F1 becoming a copying championship is a strange one, and it's odd to see it cropping up now, as if copying in F1 was ever anything new. Throw a dart at any point of F1's history and you'll find someone, somewhere, who copied another aspect of a rival's design. Now, regardless of whether Racing Point are found to have physically taken Mercedes designs and reproduced them line for line, because at the time of recording that's not been found to be the case, we're focusing on the copying championship line here, especially as there are so many examples of F1 teams who have copied their counterparts, some with more success than others. Let's start in 1970, when Colin Chapman first unveiled the Lotus 72. Its low-slung, wedge shape with boxy side pods drew more than just sideways glances, as F1's era of cigar-shaped, front-radiated chariots was set to come to an end. McLaren then went and made its own version for 1973, although arguably its 1971 M16 IndyCar design bore the largest hallmarks to the groundbreaking Lotus design, also plonking the radiators to the sides of the car and opting for the squarer bodywork. Lotus also had to watch as its ground effects were copied by basically everyone on the grid. The Lotus 78 brought the revolutionary aero concept in 1977, which lent itself to the numerous copies in the succeeding years. The Williams FW07 from 1979 looks awfully similar to the Lotus 79, but such claims of copying were probably left by the wayside as Patrick Head's design team simply executed the ground effect layout to greater success than Chapman's team could. 1979's field was littered with Lotus 79 clones. Tyrrell's 009 and Ligier's JS11 look, at a glance, very similar to the 79 in concept and shape, and we're also willing to put the McLaren M29 in that category too. There was also the Calson WK, piloted by future European touring car star Gianfranco Brancatelli, but given that only managed to DNQ twice, it was an ineffective copy at best. Although Formula One was a much looser paddock back then, less beholden to regulations dictating the design of its cars, there were still cases in which copied designs were penalised and outlawed by the governing body. Take the case of the Arrows FA1, a car pretty much thrown together at the last minute for the 1978 season. Arrows, put together by a last-minute exodus of the Shadow team, had bagged a place on the entry list at relatively short notice, and again, at a time where entries were less stringently monitored. Penned by designer Tony Southgate, the gold-liveried Arrows was immediately vilified by the Shadow team, as it looked to be an absolute facsimile of its own DN9, which Southgate had also designed. Shadow moved to get the car outlawed, and Arrow's case was based on Southgate having been a contractor, and thus the intellectual property it asserted belonged to him. But the London High Court didn't see it that way. According to the verdict, around 70% of the DN9's designs could be found in the FA1, as Southgate had opted for many of the same assemblies within. Shadow won the case, forcing Arrows to get its later A1 chassis into production. Thankfully for Southgate, the length of the legal proceedings meant that he could have a backup design ready to go. Now, I'm already sensing doubt over the examples provided, and sure, copying a design concept is a lot more fraudulent than a case of looking at a design and attempting to replicate it line for line. So let's delve into more modern times where F1 has played host to numerous chassis that bear more than a resemblance to the other cars on the grid. Let's look at 1995. The Benetton B195, powered by Renault's all-new 3-litre V10, was the class of the field, and so it wasn't often seen next to that year's Ligier JS41 on the racetrack. But when viewed side by side, they look exactly the same. The contours of the nose are the same, the side pods at the rear edge sweep down in the same manner. The early season models even had the same outlet on the engine cover. At the time, Ligier was owned by Flavio Briatore, also the team principal at Benetton, and there were more than passing rumours that the team had transferred the designs of the B195 over. The key differences were under the hood, in which Ligier had the Mugen Honda engine installed. And although the JS41's reception in testing was no less controversial than when the RP20 first appeared on track in Barcelona, there was no public protest against the car. Presumably because it was not among the Benettons and Williams on a regular basis. Perhaps the fact that Racing Point has many of the non-listed components that Mercedes has sold to the team, the waters begin to muddy. Arguably the most pertinent example of alleged copying involves Sauber's C23 car from 2004, which was allegedly a direct copy of Ferrari's F2003-GA. As Sauber's relationship with Ferrari increased at the turn of the millennium, which included being allowed to test frequently at Fiorano and Mugello, its cars also began to slowly morph into looking visually similar. Now, numerous teams have been accused of copying Ferrari's previous car, the F2002, and Toyota designer Angelo Santini was even questioned by German police as part of an espionage inquiry, but was never charged. Sauber's blue Ferrari of 2004 had drawn on many of the F2003-GA's design hallmarks, but the then Jaguar head honcho Tony Purnell questioned Sauber on infringing on Ferrari's intellectual property rights. The key sticking points here were in the Sauber team's sudden switch from its twin-keeled suspension to a Ferrari-style single keel, along with a decidedly similar front wing layout to its red liveried counterpart. Arguably, the undercut side pods were always going to filter down to the rest of the grid, but the front suspension layout was something Sauber had pioneered over the previous few years and helped it to take fourth in the Constructors' Championship in 2001. But soon after, the FIA provided a clarification that there was no compelling evidence that the 04 Sauber was a direct copy of the previous year's Ferrari, and any further complaints were presumably shelved as a result. Now, the idea of customer cars has always been a controversial one in F1, but their presence in the first 30 years of the championship immediately refutes any assertions that they are not part of F1's DNA. As recently as 2009, Toro Rosso ran virtually the same basic architecture as parent team Red Bull, albeit with a different engine and a few detail differences. Although the door was firmly slammed on customer cars after that, doing the next best thing of taking non-listed components and building a car around that inevitably leads to a similar design to the original car. Hopefully this video will build enough of a case to illustrate that the idea of mimicking someone else's handiwork is part and parcel of F1's history. Arguably, that's why the championship is able to progress technically, as engineers take ideas and move them on. In the case of Racing Point, it's arguably their competitiveness that has angered the likes of Renault and McLaren. Whether or not the brake ducts of the RP20 are found to be stripped directly off the W10 is one matter, and one for an intellectual property specialist. But the suggestion that this opens the door to F1 becoming a copying championship is ultimately false, because F1 has always been one. Make sure you let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you've liked this video, make sure you're subscribed.